The first thing to do is to wake up to the fact that something is missing. And I think that's not so difficult, because I do think a lot of people, without being able to put their finger on it at all, feel that there is something missing. And increasingly what I see amongst young people is that they feel there's a whole part of the story they are told about who we are that is lost, and that would help us to understand better where we are. Now, the trouble with the word story, like the word fable and the word myth, is that since the 19th century, they have become annexed by the left hemisphere to mean lies. So John Locke already in the 17th century was saying a metaphor is a lie. However, a metaphor is actually the only way in which we can get knowledge.
Hello and welcome to Planet Critical, the podcast for a world in crisis. My name is Rachel Donald. I'm a climate corruption journalist and your host. Every week I interview experts who are battling to save our planet. My guests are scientists, politicians, academics, journalists and activists. They explain the complexities of the energy, economic, political and cultural crises we face today, revealing what's really going on and what they think needs to be done. These are the stories of the big picture. Go to planetcritical.com to learn more and subscribe. My guest this week is Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a revolutionary neuro-philosopher. A psychiatrist, he's the author of The Master and His Emissary and his more recent book, The Matter with Things, both of which explore how the relationship between our two brain hemispheres create our understanding of the world, with Iain positing in The Master and His Emissary that the problem with today's world is that we live in a left hemisphere dominant society. We have forsaken the intuition, imagination, insight, creativity, and relationality of the right hemisphere to instead lead with the left hemisphere, which is dogmatic, technical, stubborn, and altogether less intelligent than the right. I read The Master and His Emissary about 3 years ago and I absolutely adored it. The examples that he gives from psychiatry and neuroscience are fascinating, and the way that he uses this as a frame to explore our own way of being in the world, equally interesting and also viable. Sometimes you just read a thing and it resonates in your body, and that is what Iain's work does for me. And so I was so grateful to have him on the show. We discuss the brain's relationship to meaning, agency, language, symbolism, the violence of simplification, the necessity of betweenness, of relationality, life as an experience of being in the world, humanity as an expression perhaps of something else, perhaps of the divine, of truth, of beauty, of goodness, which Iain argues are not cultural precepts, but actually morals that exist beyond us, in the very fabric of the universe. We discuss ideology and dogma, with Iain explaining how the left hemisphere gets stuck on ideas and becomes static. We discuss values, science, the improbability of life itself, the necessary condition of opposites, the fact that paradox is only a concept in the Western tradition, not the Eastern tradition. And finally, Iain explains whether or not left hemisphere patients who have suffered damage to the right hemisphere can change their minds. And here we weave in Shakespeare, Mill, Locke, intuition, oneness, the unconscious mind, and what we all need to feel fulfilled. I hope you all enjoy the episode. If you do, please share it far and wide. And if you're loving the show, become a patron on Patreon or support Planet Critical with a paid subscription at planetcritical.com. By signing up, you'll get the Planet Critical newsletter delivered straight to your inbox every week. You'll also have access to the wonderful Planet Critical community, who are full of inspiring thoughts, ideas, critiques, and determination. The links are in the description box below. I'm so grateful to everyone who chooses to support the project. I'm a vehement believer in ad-free and open access content, so Planet Critical wouldn't exist without the direct support of the amazing community. Thank you so much to all of you who keep the project going every week. Iain, welcome to Planet Critical. It is a pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, thank you very much, Rachel. I'm delighted to be here.
I'm extremely excited for this conversation. As I said just before we hit record, I read your book, The Master and His Emissary, a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, and I thought it was transcendental and offered a really beautiful theory as to why we are living so desperately, wildly out of sync with what might be termed human nature, but at least out of sync with biology, our limits, and causing sort of heedless destruction. And so I will, for anyone who hasn't read it, we will get into it. I will ask you to present that theory. But to begin with, Iain, why is the world in crisis?
Yes, it's a good question. I think there are different levels on which to answer that. And on a lower level, there are a lot of individual areas that show that we have ended up in a crisis. But I think at a higher level, or at a more profound base of the thing, there is an overarching problem, which is the way we think, and even more than that, the way we are. Because thinking sounds a bit abstract, whereas what I'm talking about is our whole way of being in the world. And here I'm reminded of something that was said by the great philosopher Whitehead. And he said, as we think, so we live. And if there's something wrong with the way we're living, it's because we think, in my view, very wrongly about who we are, what the world is, and what we're doing here in it. So, going back to the sort of more individual things, I think we've, it's no secret after all, that we've really attacked nature. I don't use the word environment. I have a little war on the word environment, because environment suggests some technical thing that happens to lie around you. Whereas I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about nature, which is in us and we are in it. The root of nature in Latin means something always about to be born, and seems a much more wonderful way of thinking than the idea of an environment, which is a technical term for which you might even have a government department. So that clearly is an area, but that represents, in my way of thinking about the hemispheres, the values of the left hemisphere, which are purely acquisitive. They're about having more, getting more, increasing our power and increasing our pleasure. And we may come on to talk about values, but to me, these are the basest values that one could possibly have. There is nothing intrinsically wrong with them, because after all, we all need to survive. And the difference between the hemispheres has evolved for reasons of survival, with the left hemisphere looking out for getting stuff, and the right hemisphere looking out for everything else. So if you can imagine that, the left hemisphere of our brain is really concerned purely with getting and grabbing, say, food, quickly and adeptly before another creature does, picking up a twig to build a nest, and for us, fashioning tools to give us control over our surroundings. So that is the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere is left looking out for everything else. While you're looking out for your prey, it's looking out for your predator, and it's looking out for everything else, your kin, your offspring, and everything else that you should be aware of in the world. So, since I'm going to talk a bit about the hemispheres, I just want to make clear that the differences that most people think they know should be forgotten, because they were based on questions we asked, which were essentially, what do the two hemispheres do? Questions you would ask of a machine. But the brain is not a machine, it's part of a person, and it helps create the person that we are. And so out of that comes a different question, which is, in what way? So in what way does it approach language or reason or visuospatial imagery or emotion or whatever? Because they both approach and give to us everything. It's just that they do them in different ways. Now, to come back to where I was saying, there are some issues that are, clearly very important, and one is that of our natural surroundings and our relationship to nature. But others are our relationship to one another, the egotistical, atomistic way in which we think that we are sort of little encapsulated beings over and against, really, everybody else, rather than partaking of everybody else and everybody else partaking of us. So, and we think of society as a composition of units, but it isn't actually. It's something much bigger than that, out of which we come, and to which we will return whatever good we can do in this life. So we are bound to one another in society. We are bound to the natural world, and we both come from the one and the other and need to give back to one and the other, and we're doing neither of those. And I think the third thing that's very important is we have completely lost any sense of religion. And I don't necessarily mean a particular church or even a particular creed, although I don't think those things in the long run can be disregarded. But I mean any sense of there being something sacred about the cosmos. And there is ample evidence, neuropsychological evidence, a good deal of which, for reasons of space, not all of which, I detail in my 2021 book, The Matter with Things. And there are three things that very, very clearly contribute to human flourishing. One is the sense of belonging to a societal group that you trust, sharing your lives with them, sharing your meals with them, depending on them for help if needed, and prepared to give help where needed, and worshipping together. That's one. The second is the relationship with nature, which until about 200 years ago, every human being since time immemorial had necessarily had a close relationship with. They lived amongst it, and their lives were governed by the relations of the seasons and the need to work the soil and to live together from that. And the third is, as I have mentioned, the sense of the divine and the cosmos, which we seem completely to have lost. And not only lost, but in a very immature way poured a kind of scorn on it, as though only people who are simple-minded could possibly believe in that sort of a thing. So that's just laying out a little bit in answer to your question.
The thing that I'm particularly curious about, Iain, is, I mean, obviously what to do about it all, but is this problem of language. And I remember vividly in the book that you suggested that, first of all, our first communication may have been singing, which then moved into poetry and then became prose and then became this very atomized technical language that leaves no room for nuance or implication or suggestion even. And that's always really stuck with me, because there's a sort of consensus, I would say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's sort of a consensus among philosophers that language creates reality. It's our shared understanding of the world that we sort of bring into being through language that creates the world around us. And yet if language, this sort of technical language, the language that we exist in today, comes from this left hemisphere, and that's true, isn't it, that language comes from the left hemisphere, then how is it that we are meant to find the words to reveal the world, and find ways to come back together through this tool which makes it?
Yes. Well, first of all, and briefly, yes, certain aspects of language are in the left hemisphere and
Right.
certain aspects are in the right hemisphere, but
Right.
speech, at any rate, is very largely, for almost everybody, including left-handers, dependent on the left hemisphere. But I suppose it depends on the way in which language is thought of. And one way of thinking of it is as if it were a way of mapping the world. So instead of having the experience of the world as one's touchstone, one invents symbols that can stand in place for those experiences and thus more quickly manipulate them in language. So language has reference in bodily experience that has no words, but ends up being words. And for the left hemisphere, language is, if you like, a schema or diagram or a map of the world. And it enables it to move those counters around, shuffle them about, and come up with what it considers logical conclusions. However, for the right hemisphere, language is much more closely what it originally was, which is an emanation of bodily experience. So I'm not an anthropologist, but I draw here, or did draw on the work of Stephen Mythen, an anthropologist, in chapter 3, I think it is, of the Master and His Emissary. And it is he who wrote the book, The Singing Neanderthals, and at some length explained that initially communication was through musical intonation. And this is still true in certain cultures, particularly those in which they are dispersed, but perhaps have a common aim, such as catching an animal. So they will be able to whistle or sing very loudly across a space, and their intentions, their meaning is immediately understood without necessarily having to transpose it into what we would think of as everyday language. So for the right hemisphere, language always brings with it an enormous amount of experience. So it may not surprise you that the left hemisphere is not very good at understanding poetry, because it reads it in a very explicit way, as though it were reading a dishwasher manual. Whereas the right hemisphere realizes that there is a lot here that is implicit, that is not made explicit, in which all the meaning lies. So a lot of it is the silence. In fact, in an early book I wrote in my 20s called Against Criticism, I have a chapter, the last chapter, called Speaking Silence, in which I suggest that real meaning lies in what we consider the gaps between the things we value. So that it is the relations between things, it is the routes that they draw on, it is the effects they have on us implicitly, embodiedly when spoken, that bring their meaning with them. And I was, brought to reflect on this very much because my first role at university was as a fellow in English at Oxford. And so I'd spent a lot of time in seminar rooms talking about poems. And it struck me that while it was very useful to do this in some ways, that what we were doing was destroying the work of art, because this work of art was completely unique in the form of words in which it existed. You take a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins or Thomas Hardy or whatever, and it just is what it is. Once it's translated into prose, it becomes inevitably banal, because there are only so many things you can say. It's very sad when someone you love dies, but that is not a substitute for the experience of reading Hardy's poems of 1912 to 13 in the wake of the loss of his wife. And secondly, it made what was unique general in nature. It was generic and abstracting, and it took away the sense of what is embodied about the experience of reading. So when you read poetry, although you're not aware of it, your skeletal musculature is contracting and relaxing in time to the feel of the flow of the verse. Of course, we know it can change your pulse rate, your blood pressure, it can bring tears to your eyes, it can make literally your hair stand on end. It can do so many things physically to you as a being, which are long, long before and primary to any discussion about what the meaning is. And unfortunately, when we get to the meaning of it, we are actually usually stripping out something which is not the meaning at all once it's taken out of context. So there are different ways in which language works. And one thing that I think is very mistaken about modern Anglo-American philosophy, which unfortunately is the main kind of philosophy still pursued in the Anglophone world, whereas most of the rest of the world has taken up the challenge of understanding the phenomenological philosophers, largely of a European continental so-called tradition, who are in my view, a revelation. Whereas the Anglo-American analytic philosophers are forever dissecting something in the hope that they will find out what it is by the time they've reduced it to nothing at all. It's rather like the dispiriting experience that I have had many times on a ward of anorexic patients, watching them trying to dissect a pea. And this is what philosophy has become in the West, a sort of hopelessly minimal turning of something into the bits. And then, of course, inevitably it finds that the bits don't account for any meaning. So apparently it had no meaning. But this would be like trying to understand a piece of music by saying, what's a piece of music? Well, it's made up of notes, isn't it? Well, let me have a look at a note. What is a note? What does it mean? Nothing. And the next one, no, it doesn't mean anything either. So when you put a lot together, surely it means nothing. But no, because it's in those gaps and relations that music speaks to us. And so it's trying to get back to the proper relation of language to experience. There's nothing wrong with language per se, but there's a great deal to be said against trying to get to the ultimate meaning of something by taking it apart. And also by saying, at the outset, we must define our terms. Because I know that makes sense in a certain way, but often you only find out what those terms are through the discourse that you have over the topic. And you get closer and closer to the meaning of these terms by the discussion you have, not by starting off with hard and fast definitions.
I also studied literature, and I had a reckoning, I would say, about 2 years ago with the written word, because it seemed to me that perhaps part of the meaning crisis was that we were writing things down and sort of fixing meanings, fixing assertions, making reality static, and thus getting stuck in some form or another that belonged to a different time. Whereas in the oral tradition of our species, in the ways that we lived for 99.9% of the time that we have been around and communicating with each other, the stories would evolve with every generation. They would be in relation with the world, and thus they would be real in a way that these other stories that, when they're written down, didn't feel anymore. They felt almost like ghost stories, if you will, remnants of a different past that we become wedded to, and thus sort of become a veil over our being in the world, our embodiment in the world. And so for me, something that I'm deeply curious about is, well, first of all, what do we do about the written word, which I don't have an answer for, but also how do we begin to be able to communicate the unsayable, or at least find a way of leaning into the uncertainty of that which we cannot put words to, that which we feel in our bodies, these ancestral knowledges, these intuitive knowledges, these imaginative knowledges as well, in order to begin to glimpse at the bigger picture for a moment, in order to be thrown, really experience the feeling of being thrown, as Heidegger would say.
Yes.
And to be comfortable as well with the idea that we can only ever glimpse it at a moment in time, because we are only ever in one part of it.
Yes, yes. Gosh, I resonate with all of that, as you can imagine. And I suppose what I draw attention to is the contrast between something which is certain, fixed and static, and something which is intrinsically never wholly certain, which is not to say it can mean anything, but it's just never wholly certain, constantly in motion and evolving, and not fixable. So, and I argue at length in The Matter of Things that if we look at the sources of our knowledge, the conclusion will be that the left hemisphere prefers the certain, fixed and static, and tries to make everything in the universe accountable in terms of the certain, fixed and static, whereas the right hemisphere appreciates their nature as never wholly certain, fluid and ultimately always interconnected and always changing. So the key word here is evolve, I think, because when you have a view that the natural condition of things is stasis until given a push, which was the Newtonian mechanical portrayal of the universe, and now we know that there's not only is that not the case, but there is nothing in the universe that is ever completely static. Everything is in motion naturally. And what has to be accounted for is not how they come to be in motion, but how they could ever come to be static, which they can't. But if you have this view, then your view of how we can, I hate to use make progress, because the word progress is such a toxic word in my view. It's this fantasy we have that all is going to get better whatever we do, which of course is utterly ridiculous and hubristic. But if we are to make, in our own terms, some progress, then I think what we have to do is think of things as evolving, because if you think of them as static, the only alternative to the eternity of what is as it is now, which is always unsatisfactory, is a complete smashing of whatever there is and a sort of revolution. And so we just destroy it all and start again. I mean, that's just another aspect of a rather adolescent hubris, because instead of taking what has been bequeathed to us by our ancestors, learnt through ages of suffering, and there's no reason to suppose they were less intelligent or less wise than we are. Indeed, there's many reasons for supposing they were more. But in any case, just throwing that away and thinking I can do it all myself, starting from scratch. And the results of such revolutions have been, without any exception, toxic in the most unbelievably horrible degree, as we've seen even in the last 100 years. So what we don't want is just chucking everything away. What we want is to realize that things are always evolving, and that they have done over the last 1,000 years. If you look at European history, and of course I do that in the Master and His Emissary, I look at the last 2,500 years, roughly speaking, of Europe. And it's very easy to see that it has gone through many, many phases. So it had traditions, yes, but tradition doesn't mean fixity. In fact, it means the exact opposite. It means something that will grow, that is a gift. Literally, tradition means being handed something. I give over, trans do. So a tradition is something which we are given and which we in turn use and will always make fresh and different. Again, of course, you see this in art, that it's not necessary to turn your back implacably on the past in art in order to make new art. There was, if you look back go to an art gallery anywhere in Europe and look at painting over the last 1,000 years, you'll be able to pretty much, if you know anything about the history of art, you'll be able to allot a period of about 50 years, roughly speaking, to almost any painting sight unseen, because things always are changing and getting to be remade new, and that is beautiful and special.
It's how reality evolves at its most fundamental form, given that the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2022 went to a team of quantum physicists who, I think after about 15, 20 years, finally managed to prove that everything in the universe is interconnected, that on a quantum level, that which happens over here is also happening over there. And so this evolution is quite literally almost how we are part of bringing the cosmos into more and more life, in a sense, perhaps even the process of life becoming conscious of itself, which somebody once said to me on this show, and I just thought was incredibly beautiful, and positions the experience of experience, which I know is a bit tautological, but really the experience of being alive and being in a body and being filled with uncertainty as part of this greater chain, not just maybe 7 generations on either side, but 7,000 generations on either side. And I think provides, hopefully, a sense of meaning. But it does really feel now that we are in a world where, despite the evidence, despite the reality, despite the chaos and the interconnecting crises, and the fact that we are hurtling through the 6th mass extinction event on Earth, we just will not change course. And it really does seem that the political realm is wedded to the idea that finding different language to explain this problem will fix it. And I wonder then what you think about Baudrillard's assertion in Simulacra and Simulation, Simulation, that in fact there is no power in the halls of power or on the seat of power at this stage, that it is all essentially a linguistic veil pulled over the truth that nobody has their hands on the wheel.
Of course, yes. So what is a veil is the belief that it is all linguistic, and that is an obscuring veil over the reality that only really at the pointy end does it ever become language, that experience is beyond language and is the basis of language, and changing the language doesn't change anything. I mean, you can see this in the fashions for using certain words for things that we think are perhaps negative. And every 10 years, the word that was chosen as the word we were allowed to use becomes a word we're not allowed to use, because the reality remains the thing that we don't like, and just changing the word doesn't get it anywhere. So believing we can solve this through language is completely absurd, and is a very left hemisphere vision. There are two things about that. One is that it sees the reality as its own scheme of symbols. It sees language in that way. And the other is it's very, very stuck. So the left hemisphere, I write a lot about this, particularly in the Master of Things, has a quality I call stickiness. And this is literal in neuropsychological terms, that patients with the right hemisphere damage become stuck. They can literally fixated on an object and unable to move their attention off it at the simplest level. But that generally speaking, left hemisphere ways of thinking become stuck in themselves because they are self-referential systems. So when they look for reality or something different, they find only the same thing that they themselves created, as though they were in a chamber without windows. Whereas the right hemisphere is in a room with windows. It is always in contact with the world. So it is always testing this idea, this thought, this perception, this concept, whatever it might be, against the reality that it experiences, against the world outside the window. There's a much better route in reality than the left hemisphere, which is frankly delusional. And I'm not just using that word in the common way that people do. I'm using it in the way a psychiatrist would use it, in that it literally becomes incapable of moving off a belief that is blatantly at odds with the facts. And so in a left hemisphere culture, we expect people to propound all kinds of preposterous ideas and say that they are completely true and that nothing else can be said. And this is the position we now find ourselves in, that we are stuck. And to free it, the only thing it can think of is, as I say, a massive destruction, a massive act of destruction to try and break out of this thing. And that is not a very sensible way forward for a host of reasons, some of which I've explained. So language is both, yes, a problem in that we believe in it too much, but it is not a solution. So the solution comes from thinking differently, and not just thinking in technical ways. So do we change our words? No, I don't mean that. I mean what people mean by the expression our hearts and minds. So in other words, our whole being, our disposition towards the world, which involves morality, emotion, and cognition. So thinking, feeling, and our moral responsibility together. And I think that we've gone adrift on each of these in the current situation we find ourselves in.
What you've just said, I think, raises a very interesting point, or perhaps entry point, in order to have a conversation about morality. Because we sort of tend to live in a world now where morality is defined as what one is not, and very much sort of in oppositional defiance of another existing set of ideologies or beliefs. And what you've described about sort of the atomization and the mechanization of the left hemisphere and its understanding of the world, and its also refusal to shift when presented with different evidence. And you give some really startling examples of this in split brain patients in your book, The Master and His Emissary. This is not just a problem that abounds on the mainstream political realm that is committed to, consuming nature and extracting from her in order to produce more and more and more wealth. We are also seeing it on the other side of the political spectrum, whereby not much power is held, by sort of the mainstream left in the Western world. And yet there is I believe, a sort of mechanistic perception of reality in that it can be completely unmade by language and completely remade by language. And that language is not created through a collaborative consensus-making process. And that language must not leave room either for investigation, exploration, challenge, but rather, and I've said this before recently on the show, it sort of presumes a Descartesian, I think, therefore I am God, up on high, objective view down to the horizon, and everyone must also agree with. And I understand where this came from. It came from postmodernism, which did start out with a pretty decent proposal, which was maybe we should let more people speak. Maybe a diversity of voices and experiences and narratives will allow us to glimpse at the bigger picture. That is unfortunately not what happened, though. There is now a sort of violent shuffling in order to get one's position, one's godlike sort of Eye of Sauron perspective on the whole thing. And so I'm particularly interested in how we come to talk about morality, moving beyond these oppositional binaries, moving beyond identifying with victimization, for example, and even how human agency comes into play there, because can we truly be agents of morality if sort of constantly convincing ourselves of this self-referential system? And so how do we move beyond that as well to come to a proper dialogue on morality, or a capability of acting as moral agents? And it might be here that you want to refer to your work on values and purpose, which I've heard you threading throughout, but I know you want to get into.
Yes. Well, I think one of the problems is that morality is not a theory, and it is not an ism. And in the modern world, we live in a conflicting battlefield of isms of various kinds. And these isms always miss the point. I mean, any ism is, by definition, a dogmatic imposition on the world. And so it's pointless having these inevitably false visions clashing with one another. We have to get out and away and beyond isms and begin thinking in a much more subtle way about what morality is. Morality is not using certain words or doing certain things. I mean, this is a very big topic, one which I talk about more in The Master and His, sorry, not in The Master and His Emissary, in The Matter with Things. So let me give you a rather clear example about doing things. So an experiment was done in which a person was asked to address a moral question, first of all with the left hemisphere inactivated and then with the right hemisphere inactivated. And in the scenario, there are two friends having coffee together. And one friend puts what she thinks is poison into her friend's coffee, but it turns out to be sugar, and the friend lives. In the other scenario, the two are having coffee together, and the first woman puts what she thinks is sugar in her friend's coffee, but it turns out to be poison, and the friend dies. Now the question is, which was the more immoral scenario? Well, I think most of us would agree the more immoral one was where the person intended to kill. And that is the answer that the right hemisphere clearly gives. But the answer the left hemisphere gives is no. The immoral act was the one where somebody died. After all, in the other situation, nobody died. So what was wrong? So you see, judging by actions is a very poor way to understand morality. It's not, it leads you to all sorts of ghastly possible scenarios. Another one I rather like is a general practitioner has 5 patients on his list who require organ transplants, but finding matches is difficult for them. And a perfectly healthy person comes into his surgery one day and says he needs a prescription or something. And the doctor has a look and realizes that this person is a perfect match for his 5 patients who need organs. So isn't the moral thing for him to do to kill the patient and allow the other 5 to live? And this is the kind of absurdity you get into in a left hemisphere dominated world. I should just gloss here that the left hemisphere is much less intelligent than the right hemisphere. One of the monstrous things about the old pop psychology was that the left hemisphere may be a bit boring, but at least it was in touch with reality, reliable, dependable, and so on. It isn't at all. As I say, it's frankly delusional. One of the emotions that most strongly lateralizes is that of anger, and guess what? It lateralizes to the left hemisphere, which gets very upset if it's confronted. And it doesn't listen to information. It gets more embedded. If you challenge it by saying, but look at this, it just goes, no, I insist I'm right. And I've noticed this in hospitals and universities, 2 areas in which I have some experience, that when managers produce some wretched policy that any professional in the world will say it's not going to work, and finally, of course, the evidence becomes clear it's not working. When you show them that, they don't think, oh, okay, well, maybe this was the wrong approach. They double down on it and say, we haven't gone far enough. If we just go further, we will find the answer. And that, mutatis mutandis, can be applied across the realm of debates on many things that, it's not working, but we just need to do more and more of it, which means we don't understand that things have a dark side. And this is also a moral issue, so it's relevant here. That there is nothing so good that if you push it too far, it will not turn into something bad. Most usually, the very bad thing, the very thing that you thought was bad, that you were trying to get away from. So a simple example is you think that personal freedom is good. I agree with that, up to a point. But if you push and push personal freedom, you end up in anarchy. And what happens in anarchy? Tyranny. So you try to avoid something and you only embrace it.
Can we stop there? Oh,
Yes.
It's wonderful that you've just said that, because I listened to you say that somewhere else, and I put it down in my notes in preparation for this.
Yes.
Because as far as I understand, and I had a researcher on the show very recently talking about civilizations throughout history, complex civilizations, and including the existence of complex egalitarian systems that were essentially anarchical in that there was no ruler leading them, but they were a sort of collaborative consensus-making project and often outlasted their neighboring sort of hierarchies of domination, centralized states, if you will. So is it true that anarchy always leads to violence and then tyranny? Because history would suggest otherwise.
Well, I didn't think it would, to be honest. Where there is anarchy, for example, was at the end of the Roman Empire, when things simply fell apart and nobody knew where there was any power. And it did end up in a tyrannical defeat of the Roman culture and the imposition of a new culture. For a long time, it was extremely bloody and not a kind of period that one would want to live through. revolutions have a history of going from everybody must have the same power to almost immediate tyranny by individuals. Look at the Soviet experience. Within only about 3 years of the revolution, there was already a tyrannical state which went on until 1991. So when people throw off their chains, as they think, and as they did in Iran, they immediately find an imposition of a tyranny. I mean, the world's worst tyranny at the moment has to be, I would have thought, Iran. And it is the result of a revolution against something they thought was tyrannical at the time, but was much less so. So, no, I don't think that is right. I can't think of it. Can you think of a historical example where anarchy works peacefully?
Well, I suppose it, defining terms, I suppose it does depend what we mean by anarchy, because I think that, we have lots of evidence of existing societies today that, very much attempt to not be managed by an overseeing state, typically indigenous cultures around the world, that are limited by their size, which is perhaps...
That's a very important point.
The reality of their success, absolutely.
Much as I admire the way in which indigenous peoples have managed to live in harmony with nature for very long periods and not affected their surroundings in the way that we have, and have wisdom that I think we could all learn from, it is a fiction that they live in perpetual harmony. They don't. And they often have extremely bloody conflicts between tribes, and the rape and murder of one tribe by another, and so forth. I mean, these are unpleasant realities, but they are part of the reality. So I'm just saying there isn't this golden age possibility that your correspondent or interviewer or interviewee was suggesting, in my view, unless something can be proven to the contrary.
Let me just respond, and then we can move on, because neither of us are this is not your field. But I do want to say that it looks like certainly what Luke was talking about, and he's just written a book. He's a researcher at the University of Cambridge. That the stats that we have on interpersonal violence, for example, in a lot of nomadic groups throughout history, and that currently exist in the world as well. I mean, the range is quite high, but there certainly are societies in which interpersonal violence is almost zero, essentially. And in the work that I've been doing recently for my own book, I have found that there is evidence as well of societies in which, for example, sexual abuse is almost non-existent. And it does connect with the people's relationship, funnily enough, not just to gender equality, etc., but also to the relationship towards nature more widely. And so I suppose I'm just curious about this idea or this possibility, sort of what you're saying about this left brain mechanized, atomized perspective of the world, that being a fundamentally violent force, and that a revolution from one form of society that sort of built itself up with violence may very well inevitably produce another form of violence, because quite frankly, and big word coming up, but the onto-epistemological frameworks with which people make their decisions simply haven't changed.
It's interesting that you cite evidence that there is almost no sexual abuse in some of these tribal groups, but there is also, as you undoubtedly know, evidence that it is absolutely endemic in many from quite an early age for the children. So I think it's pointless for us to... I find myself, because of my passion for truth, I find myself often arguing the other way about something, because I think there is truth that is good, but I think it can be exaggerated. We can get noble savage stories, which are romances. And that I don't really want to go into that. But it was just really to say...
Yes, of course. Yes.
That morality is not a matter simply of deeds and outcomes, because these can be empty. You can say all the right things, for example, and be a not very pleasant person. In fact, I found that in life, people who are passionate about being a citizen of the world, as it were, are not very good citizens of their own country, and actually not very particularly admirable people. So there are people who say things that are all the right things to say, but in their personal life are not particularly admirable or moral people, often quite cold people. Whereas there are other people who say things because they believe them to be true that are unfortunately stigmatized as things that no decent person should say, who in fact turn out to be generous and kind people. So I think trying to judge people's morality on the basis of things they say or do is wrong. It has to be really a matter of one's own heart. And people will say, well, I don't know how to be objective about that. But that's the problem of forming judgments about other people on too little information. It's not a problem about morality. Morality is a matter of the heart. It is, but I don't mean that it has nothing to do with thinking. You understand me, that when I say the heart, I don't just mean emotion. I mean emotion that is embedded in, thinking that is embedded in embodied being. And one of the dangers of our world is thinking that is no longer embedded in embodied being at all, but is the sort of thing that would be taken up by a computer in the abstract. And it is very dangerous when we start thinking like that. So I do think, I don't know why we got onto morality actually, but I can't remember where all this began, but I think that, I think more important even than morality in the conventional sense of values overall. So perhaps you could allow me just to unpack a bit about what I mean by that. So I think that in the current received world picture, at least that of scientism, and I'm making a distinction, the familiar one, between science itself, which is a noble and unimpeachable project when carried out with an open mind, and scientism, which is a closed-minded set in which one believes that science can answer all our questions. Well, it simply can't. And questions that go beyond science and beyond reason are not unscientific or irrational. They're just beyond science and reason. And an obvious example is our music and religion and so on. They're simply not... I'm not saying that science can't study them. I'm not saying that one cannot rationalize about them, but you will never reach the core of what they are that way. And so what I'm thinking of is a broad sense of values in a way which I think probably for most of us comes from the Platonic tradition of truth, beauty and goodness as being the primary virtues, the primary values to which the soul aspires. And I take the view that these values are not things that we paint onto the world for our own satisfaction, but are things that pre-exist us and are intrinsic to the structure of the cosmos. Now, I'm not saying, and it's just not a counter-argument to say, well, at one point people thought that, Rubens thought that fat women were beautiful, and then later people thought thin women were beautiful and so on. I'm not saying that we can't change our cultural perceptions of things, of course we can, but the fact that painting can be beautiful is at another level altogether. And interestingly, Darwin saw there was a problem in just saying that beauty is a way in which one selects mates, because it says it's very obvious to see that certain colours or forms are beautiful. But what is beauty? What makes them beautiful in the first place so that they can have that function? And he's right that there is something there that is unaccountable in left hemispheric terms. So I think these things pre-exist us, and I think they also account for why there is life. Indulge me for a few minutes while I explain why I think that to be the case. Yes. Once again, I go back to A.N. Whitehead, who incidentally I consider to be the most profound and interesting philosopher of the last 100 years, at least in the Anglophone world. And he raised the very interesting question, why should there be life at all? And reasons for thinking that there shouldn't be life is that it is enormously complex and energy consumptive in a universe in which we are told that things are constantly getting less complex and dissipating energy. So that is supposedly the fate of the universe, and life kicks against it. Now, it is not an argument that that can't happen. It can. There can be, even though the general trend may be downwards, there may be upkicks in a curve. I perfectly understand that. But it takes something to make that need to happen. And indeed, life is a very improbable emission from an inanimate universe. And the second thing about it is that we say, well, in life, organisms are struggling for survival, and those that win this battle for survival are those that live the longest. Well, there's a couple of things that's wrong with that. And probably the most important one is that very ancient life, some of the first life that we know of, is very, very long-lived. So there are simple single-cell actinobacteria at the base of the ocean, single examples of which may live 1 million years. And as we have evolved, we've gone to shorter lives, like our own of 70 years on average. So that isn't really what the evolution of humanity and its direction is about. What could it be about? If there is a universe that has the potential to both create, I think that is an essential fact about the universe that can't be denied. I mean, you can deny many things, but if you look at the history of the universe, you can't deny that it has created extraordinary complexity out of a relatively simple origin, as we are told. Also, it has created things of great beauty, and it has created the possibility, therefore, for the unfolding of things were, if you like, potential within that first ground of being. That ground of being was a mass of potential that had so far not precipitated anything into being. But over the history of the universe, it has precipitated more and more of that vast, perhaps infinite field of potential into being. That is the story, I believe, of the unfolding of the life of the cosmos. And we play a part in this, in that, first of all, with more complex creatures, probably not beginning with mammals, but certainly amplified in mammals, they have the capacity to recognize beauty in a very primitive way. And then coming forward as they get more complex, appreciating different kinds of beauty, they also appreciate goodness. This doesn't begin with human beings. Certainly apes have a strong sense of injustice, will also forego hurting another creature if thereby they can get food. They may be starving and they may need food, but they're taught that the only way they can do so is by pressing a button which gives an electric shock to the monkey in the next cage. And they would rather starve than see that monkey suffer. There are many instances of dogs in an entirely altruistic way, going out of their way to rescue other beings, not necessarily dogs. So I think these things begin to evolve and are at their so far highest evolutionary point in human beings. And there's no reason to suppose that we're the end of the story of evolution. We just happen to be where we are now. So I think that our role is to image back and respond to these values. Now, why respond? Because I believe that everything in the universe is resonant, responsive, and responsible in its relation to everything else. That things come about through relations. And as you may know, I argue that relations are primary. In other words, they come before the relata, the things that are related. That sounds paradoxical to our left hemisphere way of thinking, which says, how can there be connections or relations before there are things to be related? But here again, I would image, and stop me when you want to, but I mean, the image of Indra's net, which is a Vedantic image of an Indian god, Indra, who spread a net over the cosmos. And that is a protective veil, if you like. And in that net, at every crossing point in the net, of which there are obviously an almost infinite number, there is suspended a jewel, and in each jewel, every other jewel in the net is imaged. That is an extraordinary image of the unfolding of something into many, but its intrinsic oneness. And you said earlier about a world which is divided and one that is united. It's very important that it must be both. It can't just be one. Now, that apart from anything else, nothing can ever be one thing without its opposite actually coming in. I can go back to that if you want, talking about the dark side in human beings. But one particular opposition that necessarily must exist with both poles present is that of the one and the many. And many other traditions, almost all Oriental traditions, have this as a basic tenet. I was talking to a very interesting Chinese academic the other day, and she said, well, of course, in Chinese, we don't see paradoxes. What in the West is called a paradox arises because you think a thing and its opposite can't be true. But in our way of thinking, they are just different manifestations. And they may manifest at different points in time, of course, but they may manifest at the same time as well. So there is a tension between them that creates something. It's a Hegelian idea of a thing and its opposite coming together and creating something new that isn't in either of the two original things. And an image I often use, but again, it's worth using, is that of Heraclitus' idea of the string of the lyre or the string of the bow that is under tension. It only works if it's being pulled in opposite directions at once. If you let one go slack, there is no arrow flies from the bow, there is no note flies from the lyre. You have to have them both held together. And in our world, we don't hold these opposites together. We think, this opposite is good, I don't want that one. And immediately things collapse. And sometimes I say this is like sawing the end off a bar magnet, because I like the North Pole, but I don't like the South Pole. You end up with a magnet with the South Pole, it's just a shorter magnet. That's what we're doing all the time at the moment, because we're running away from things. So inexclusively, it necessarily, let me put it that way, necessarily part of what it is we're looking at. So I've gavelled on there a bit, but I hope that's explain something, and it comes back to this idea that the cosmos is unfolding itself, and that the ground of being, call it God, call it Logos, call it Li, call it call it Atman, call it whatever you like. Whatever it is that is the creative principle that generates the universe is in a never-ending dance with what it is that is coming forth into being, in which that ground of being gets to know itself and know what is in it ever better.
I feel like I could sit and pick your brain all day, so to speak, and hope that we have the opportunity in the future. But for now, I'm conscious of time. And what I'm particularly curious about, to draw from your expertise, is you've said that we live in this sort of left hemisphere culture. Everything that you're saying definitely points to that. And so, what does it take for left hemisphere patients to come to terms with reality and to realize the errors of their analysis, for example? And is there anything that we can learn from that that we can map onto our dominant global culture?
Yes, well, I'll begin with the bad news, which is that effectively there's very little that can be done for a left hemisphere dominant or right hemisphere damaged patient in the longer run. There are very long rehab programs in which people are encouraged to, see things slightly differently, but it's a long and not terrifically rewarding process. And this is because in psychiatry, we speak of insight, which means specifically insight into your problem. So, for example, a psychotic patient, by definition, doesn't really have insight because they believe the reality they're experiencing. So they don't have insight that actually this is not really the reality everyone else is sharing. And one of the reasons for this is that psychosis is very, very strongly associated with right hemisphere deficits. The right hemisphere is the one that has insight. So you can see that there's a catch-22 here, because if you haven't got the insight, it's hard for you to get insight. So, so that all having been said, to think about it from a different point of view, because of course a society isn't the same as an individual who literally has brain damage. The thing I'm constantly pointing out is that we've all got perfectly well-functioning right hemispheres. It's not that they've gone on the blink as they have in a neuropsychiatric patient. It's that they're no longer attending to what the right hemisphere is telling them. So the first thing to do is to wake up to the fact that something is missing. And I think that's not so difficult, because I do think a lot of people, without being able to put their finger on it at all, feel that there is something missing. And increasingly what I see amongst young people is that they feel there's a whole part of the story they are told about who we are that is lost, and that would help us to understand better where we are. Now, the trouble with the word story, like the word fable and the word myth, is that since the 19th century, they have become annexed by the left hemisphere to mean lies. So John Locke already in the 17th century was saying a metaphor is a lie. However, a metaphor is actually the only way in which we can get knowledge. And I go into that at quite some length in chapter 3 of the Master and His Emissary. So all these words really once had a lineage which meant that they were the way to truth, but that has been lost. In our time, Martin Shaw has strongly argued, and very vividly because he is a storyteller, that the only way we can understand is through stories. And this has a very, very long tradition, that the really deep truth cannot be conveyed except through a narrative, through a, quote, fable, but which is literally a thing that is worth saying. And so to get there, the first thing is to see that we are losing something, as I say. And the second is to have some inkling as to what that is. Now, I'm really not here. It's rather embarrassing for me to say this, because I'm really not here angling for more sales from my books. But one of the things that readers constantly report to me is I had an intuition that there was a lot that was wrong, that we weren't paying attention to. And in reading your book, I've come to recognize it and to be able to express it and to start to seek it. So I can't duck saying that for a lot of people, a way to see that is to read what I've got to say on the subject. But also, I think that probably by reading Eastern so-called mystical texts like the Tao Te Ching and the I Ching and so on, these texts are other ways in which young people, including myself, back in the 70s or 60s, got to an insight that Western thinking was missing something. And Heraclitus is from our own tradition, but comes from before the time of Plato and Aristotle, and therefore contains insights into what we now call paradox. And it really is not a paradox unless you buy the story that we have been inculcated with, which is that a thing and its opposite cannot both be true. But the experience of life shows me that very often that is the case. There are all kinds of rather less important, but practically important things that can be done. I say less important because unless you have this change of viewpoint, this change of the way in which you attend to the world, the rest doesn't really add up to a hill of beans. But let's set that aside for the moment. I've made that point. But what practical things can be done? I think number one is education. I think there is a catastrophe in our educational system, which is that in keeping with the way in which we now think, that everything is about utility, which means direct value for money. The education has come to be confined to things where you teach facts and schemas for dealing with them, things like the sciences and maths and tech subjects. And I'm far from saying these are not important subjects. I studied them myself, and I think they are important. But I don't think that they're an education in themselves. An education actually means not the putting in of stuff, which this process is, but the drawing out of stuff from within you that you already have there. So awakening those insights that are latent in all people. And that is done through things like learning your own history, the history of your people, and preferably in as apolitical way as possible, so that we can keep an open mind about its virtues and its vices. Studying literature, I mean, above all, I suppose, for English people, the works of Shakespeare. But of course, there's very, very, very much more. We have one of the richest, if not the richest, literature in the world. So studying that, studying music, studying drama, and also practicing skills which I think are easily learned and very important and completely absent from the curriculum, which are how to examine your own thinking critically. So, an example for me is we were taught to argue for a viewpoint that we felt was importantly true. And then having done that, the work started. Now argue for the opposite point of view as convincingly as you can. And I think if you don't do that, you don't even understand your own point of view. This was a remark made by the eminently sane John Stuart Mill, who said, if you only know your own side of the argument, then you know precious little of that too, because you really only understand it in relation to the things that could be said on the other side. So those are some of my thoughts.
I want to share a little anecdote with you because I think it will resonate with you. I remember being 15 and sitting in my English literature class, and we were doing Shakespeare, and it was one of his sort of pieces, one of his phrases about a rose. I don't think it was my about Juliet, but I think it came from something else. Anyway, the teacher asked us to go through what do we think this metaphor could mean. And we were a good class, we generated about 25 different possibilities. And then somebody from the back asked, oh, do you think that Shakespeare had all of these possible meanings in mind when he wrote that statement, that phrase, this piece of magic? And she said, yes, absolutely. And I remember thinking, what a load of course not. That's not where poetry comes from. It's not this technical thing where you consider how can I generate the most possible meanings for a thing in order for it to be meaningful. It's speaking to all of us in a different way. That's why we have these 25 different possibilities. And it has stayed with me, that moment. I mean, my teacher was great, but that moment has stayed with me. It stayed with me throughout my literature degree. All of us trying to sort of tear apart and analyze. And I got to wondering, where do we learn to just let something speak through us? Where do we learn to just simply be moved by it? And I know absolutely nothing about the way that Indigenous cultures engage with literature, apart from the fact that this is something that they do not do. This sort of textual analysis that is present in Western education. It's not about trying to impose a possibility on whatever is in front of you, but trying to be moved by and create something new from. And I think that is so profoundly different, probably from the right hemisphere, I imagine, and a completely different way of engaging with the world.
That's very good. I suppose the first thing to say is it depends what you mean by did he have those in mind? Because we tend to think mind means the bit we're conscious of. But they're obviously somewhere in his mind, and most of everything we know is not something we're immediately conscious of. We can bring ourselves to be conscious of it by sitting in a classroom and coming up with ideas. That's right. But it works, as you so rightly say, at a different level. And I think people sometimes imagine that the unconscious mind is like a sort of dark cellar underneath the house in which everything happens. and it's full of spiders and sort of well, possibly wine, I don't know, but the but it isn't like that. It's more like a stage, and so imagine a stage set, and there is a spotlight that is on a chair, for example. Now, the rest of the auditorium and the rest of the stage have not disappeared. They're simply not illuminated at the moment. If you move the spotlight, they'd all be there. And I think that the contents of our mind are like that, except that the proportion is so much greater that is not visibly in the spotlight. So the proportion, I used to say, was about 95% was out of the spotlight. But some recent research suggests with amusing specificity that 99.44% of all that we know is not in the spotlight. So I don't think we need to get hung up on the numbers, but the point is very clear that the stuff is there and doing work, even though it is not fully in the glare of consciousness. Now, you may or may not know that in my 20s, I wrote a book called Against Criticism, which was really about what goes wrong when we do literary processing. And exactly the sort of thing you're talking about was one of the points I was making. So, yes, of course. But, I've come to see that there are stages, and everything depends on it being a three-part process. It's from right to left and back to right again. And this lies behind all my work. And forgive me if I've said this before, and when you come to put it up, you can cut little bits out like this. But if I haven't said it before, I'll say it now. So an example is you love a piece of music. You're a pianist. You start to play it. And the conception of the piece, the reason you're attracted to it is that you've heard it and your right hemisphere has understood it. And now when you're trying to recreate it yourself, there's a sort of problem because you start, but obviously there are bits you need to practice over and over again, and you need to note the fingering, and you need to understand the harmonic progressions and so forth. So that is all rather detached and analytic and left hemisphere. But when you go back on stage to perform it, you must forget all that. But that's not to say that that was not important. It was very important at one stage. Now it has been unpacked, and that unpacking has been taken back in again at a higher level into an integral whole. And the same thing I find looking at art with my brother, who's an art historian. And I love a certain painting, and I love hearing him talk about it because he draws my attention to things I hadn't really seen there. But when I go, when I'm subsequently appreciating that work of art, I'm not kind of searching for those little points, but my overall appreciation of it is enriched. And so this is always the way it must go. But in our culture, we always go right to left, stop. And this is like, as I say, trying to understand a motorbike by taking it apart on the garage floor and saying, well, we've got 2 of these and 4 of those, and heaven knows what this whole damn thing means. But of course, you need to put it together again and ride it. And it's in riding it you understand what a motorbike is. And we as a culture think we take anything, we take it to bits, and we look at the bits and top them up, and we've found out the answer to what it really is. The most ludicrous example of this would be a piece of music. What is a piece of music? It's made of notes. Okay, well, what is a note? Let me understand that. Once I understand what a note is, I'll understand the meaning of the whole piece. Of course, a single note, what does it mean? Nothing. Another note, nothing. So 20,000 of these, nothing. There's hundreds, 20,000 of these. But of course, the meaning comes out of the connections, the spaces, the relations in the whole.
Oh, Iain, this has been such a magical conversation. And just you saying that, it reminds me of the fact that obviously there was a big scientific hoo-ha around splitting the atom. Hopefully, I think there was the hope maybe that some kind of God particle would be at the middle, that something would be revealed going down to its smallest part. And then they split it and they found that there were these things called quarks. And they thought, well, we'll just have to get inside of those as well. And then they split another level, and it was yet more something, another name, quark something. And they keep splitting these things apart, these infinitesimal things. And there's just more and more and more and more. And we have to wonder, I mean, at what point do we stop and just start putting things back together again? This
Yeah.
process of healing that which we have rendered asunder.
Yes, exactly. And of course, this implies very strongly to society. So, you thought, well, society is just an aggregation of individual egos. That is certainly a way in which a lot of people think about society. And they think that what society should do is leave them free to exercise their ego to its full extent, without understanding that a self only is a self because it is generated by sociality, by, first of all, relationship with the mother, then with both parents, with the family, with the local community, and so forth. This is how we develop and how we develop our understanding of other people. And so, again, I'm not saying that the individual should be lost in the mass. This is another very, very important point. That it's not either we have to be sort of rampant individuals or that we have to be lost in a kind of Soviet state. Neither of these are desirable outcomes at all. Each of them will destroy a society. What instead we need is for the individual person to fulfill themselves through, not in spite of, but through relations with other people, with nature, with art, and, in my view, with the divine, whatever one understands that to be. And so those are the things that fulfill us and make us what we are, not by cutting ourselves off from them, but by instead going through them to find something deeper. I think this is another important point. It's what I call translucency or semi-transparency. So, for example, if you're looking at a work of art, your eye doesn't stop on the plane of the canvas and go, well, there's a thick piece of paint here that's kind of vermilion. And so you don't analyze the surface. But you see through the painting, not by turning your back on the painting, obviously, but by seeing what is latent in the painting, which is a whole other level of experience and meaning. And in doing that, you don't lose sight of what you might call the surface effect of the canvas. That is critical to it, but you see through it, not in spite of it, but because of its translucency. Now, all art is like this, and I believe people are like this, and life is like this, that we can rest our eye on the surface, and that's not enough. We should be using the surface to allow us to see through to a deeper level, but that doesn't mean turning our backs on the immediate. So, for example, I believe that we see the eternal through the finite and through the temporally bound. We don't turn our backs on the temporal in order to find the eternal. We see the eternal through the temporal. And lots of poets have said this. In a way, this is what Blake was saying, it's what Goethe said, and so forth. So these are all parts of the picture.
Everything that, in fact, I will say to you what I said to an Aboriginal woman recently. I was with some Aboriginal elders in the Australian outback, and I was having their how do I begin to explain this? Essentially, the concept of a family tree explained to me. And what I understood, because it involves all kinfolk, not just people that you're connected to by blood, all people, and also every single living being, it seemed to me this incredible system, essentially of what we might call resource management in quite a technical way, but definitely a system of respect and defining and allowing sort of relationality. And she said to me at the end, she'd been speaking for like an hour, and I was just enwrapped. And she said, oh, this must all sound quite funny to you. This must all sound a little bit crazy. And I said, no, it sounds like the truth. It sounds like the truth. And this is the thing. This is why I found your book so moving when I read it a few years ago, and listening to you speak now. It just sounds like the truth. And maybe I can't quite put my finger on it, but that's what truth is, isn't it? That's sort of what all the major philosophers have said too. It's something that speaks through us. We are conduits.
And that's another thing I loved in what you said when you last were explaining your experience with Shakespeare, is that we need also to realize that experience happens through us. It's not exactly made by us, although we come into it. And I think the work of artists like this, it is revealed to the artist. And the artist has, it's not as though the artist is just kind of like going, whatever. The artist is hearing something call to him or her. And it's in that calling that the shape of something that is about to come into being is first glimpsed. And once that is glimpsed, there is a sort of midwifing into being of something that comes from elsewhere.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it is like birth and like nature, because, as I may have said, nature means something ever more being born, which the environment is a terrible term, which should be, excised from our vocabulary.
Iain, I feel like we could ping back and forth all day. And as I said, I could keep picking your brains, but I understand I do have to let you go. Before I do, could you tell me, who would you like to platform?
Charles Foster. So Charles is a professor at Oxford who is an extraordinary mind. He is fairly much a polymath. And he started life as a vet and still has a prodigious understanding of animals and a bond with them, and wrote a book which has had quite a lot of success called Being a Beast. And that's about his attempt to understand from the inside what another animal's life is like. I mean, of course, you can't actually become that other animal, but he tried as far as possible to imagine what it was like to live in an underground set like a badger, or lie in a stream and catch fish with your teeth like an otter and so on. But he, at a more serious level, he's a very important moral philosopher, and he has an ensouled vision of the world that he and I very closely share. And he went on, as I say, from being a vet to being a lawyer and a philosopher. Well, he's always been a philosopher. And we came together through a legal case in which he was the barrister and I was the medical expert. And we discovered we had a lot in common. We've got these different, I'd gone from the arts to medicine, he'd gone from veterinary science to the arts. And he has an inexhaustible gift for writing about interesting subjects. So I think he would be a good person to invite on and see where the conversation goes.
Wonderful. Well, those are my favorite types. Iain, thank you so much for your time and for your work. It's been a great pleasure speaking with you.
No, well, thank you very much, Rachel. I much enjoyed talking with you too.
If you want to learn more, I've put links to everything in the description box below. Remember to subscribe to the channel if you're new here and share the episode if you enjoyed it. To support the show, subscribe at planetcritical.com, where you can read the weekly newsletter. You can also become a Planet Critical patron. All links are in the description box below. As always, my deepest thanks to that community. Planet Critical wouldn't exist without your support. Thank you everyone for listening and for coming on this journey together.